So this topic is all about poetry, and there is no doubt that poetry can be one of the trickier parts of the literacy aspects on the transfer test, as it's often written in a style that we have to try and decode, as the author uses a variety of authorial techniques, which is just a fancy pants word for writing skills, to help us feel and paint pictures in our minds about the content of the poem. My number one tip, even before we break this down further, is to read. Read a wide variety of texts, including poetry. Through reading alone, we help to build a better vocabulary, which makes it easier to understand what the author is trying to convey or say through his writing, and it also gives us lots of experiences of the various different authorial techniques that go into writing the different genres of text. Poetry, for example, is often about feelings, humour, painting pictures in our minds through words, and to do this, the author uses lots of different writing techniques that you could easily recognise if you've seen them in action before. Built up over time, this gives us a much better chance of understanding the various different genres of text that you will see presented in the transfer test. So, read, and read some more. With that said, we can break poetry down into various features that we can recognise and better understand. So in this session, we are going to take a look at two of these authorial techniques, similes and metaphors. Okay, so let's talk a little about what a simile and a metaphor is and get them nice and clear in our minds before we begin. Okay, so similes and metaphors are figures of speech. They're examples of figurative language, and figurative language is just a fancy way of saying it's a word that you use or a phrase that you use that does not have its everyday normal meaning. Okay, it's a way of saying something without using the correct or literal words that you would use. In figurative languages, words are used to create mental images by comparing ideas. Now, these comparisons help us to make the reader imagine a person, a place, or a thing that's being described. That's why the author uses them. It's to paint that picture in your mind. Now, writers use similes to emphasize a certain characteristic. So they make writing more interesting and entertaining and colourful because they often find a link between two subjects. For example, the children ran around the playground like a pack of wild animals. So instead of just talking about the children running around the playground, we've referred to them like something else, like a pack of wild animals, which makes you think how crazy a pack of wild animals would be running around, creating chaos in the playground. Now, like similes, metaphors do compare and link two things together, but, however, a simile is a simple comparison, whereas the metaphor states that the two subjects are the same. So let me give you a quick example of that. In the playground, the children were a pack of wild animals. Now, I didn't compare them necessarily to a pack of animals. I said they were the pack of wild animals. So that's the main difference. In a simile, you're saying something is like something else. And in a metaphor, you're saying it is something else. And even though you're comparing it to something completely different, you're still drawing the comparison. So let's take a look at a few more examples of similes and metaphors and break it down even further. Now, in this example, you can see I've got a little definition up at the top. We've summarised what we've talked about now. A simile compares one thing to another. And the quick way to find them is to look for words or sentences that contain the words as, like, or than. So if you can scan through text or poetry and look for as, like, or than, then read around that, read the sentences and see what they contain, and you're looking for something being compared to something else. So for example, he was as cunning as a fox. We're comparing the cunningness of a fox to a human being. She slept like a log. Again, the features of a log lying still, not moving. We're comparing that to how she slept. And then finally, he was faster than a speeding train. Again, comparing the characteristics of how somebody moved to a speeding train. So the simile compares one thing to another, and there is your quick way of finding them, looking for the words as, like, or than. Now, let's take a quick look at a metaphor. Now, in this example, up at the top, it says a metaphor is a comparison between one thing and another without the use of the words as, like, or than. They actually say something is something else. Okay, so it just basically points out that this is something else. It's not comparing them using the words as, like, or than. So here's a few examples. The lake is a sheet of glass this morning. So it creates that picture in your mind about how smooth that lake looks just by saying it is something else. A sunset is a rainbow of colours. A blanket of snow covered the street. So all of those things help to create a picture in our mind, and it helps us to figure out what the author is trying to tell us. So let's now take a look at a couple of examples and decide, are they similes or are they metaphors? Here we have 4 examples from the top. The thief was as slippery as an eel. What do you think? Stop and think. Simile or metaphor? Hopefully you picked simile. Next one. The moon was a misty shadow. That one is a metaphor. The story was as old as the hills. That one is a simile. And finally, the lion was a warrior in battle. That one too was a metaphor. Okay, so you're looking for the words as, like, or than, and then seeing if it compares one thing to another. That's typically how you would use quickly scan sentences and figure out whether they're similes or metaphors. Now, one of the other types of questions you might get in the transfer test is to identify them in the lines of the poetry. So let's take a look at a little piece of writing, not poetry in this case, but just a piece of writing, and see if we can find the similes and the metaphors in this little bit of text. Now, I want you to take a few minutes to read through this little piece of text and then point out or make a little note on a piece of paper where you think the similes and the metaphors are, and in 5 seconds time I'm going to give you the answers. So pause the video now. Okay, so the answers are sharp blade is the metaphor because we've said the wind is a sharp blade. Blocks of ice is a metaphor because we've said her feet were blocks of ice. And swallowing up the bear before it had a chance to attack. Swallowing is a metaphor as well because we're saying what the ground did and we're describing it like something else. And the similes in this case are like lightning because we've ran like lightning, like a winged bird because the bear rushed at her like that and we made that comparison, and as still as stone, we compared how still somebody stood to a stone, and like a giant mouth is the last simile in there. So hopefully you found all of those in the text as well. So you can see that poetry is not straightforward. It's sort of hidden meanings within different writing techniques. Similes and metaphors are typically used in poetry, and if we can read and become familiar with lots of different examples of it, it makes it much easier to identify them in poetry because you may have seen them or heard them before. However, we now have some clear ways that we can identify them using the as, like, or than, or if it says something is something else. So we have a couple of ways that if we come across a new piece of poetry, we can actually pick out the similes and metaphors in it. Okay, that's it for this session. We'll continue with poetry in the next video, and we'll look at other authorial techniques or other features that poetry writers might just use.